Red Horizon by Jasper Hawke. Chapter 1. The Disappearance. City, Vienna, Austria. Time, 2:00 a.m. Setting, a dimly lit hotel room overlooking the quiet cityscape. The soft hum of distant traffic blends with the occasional murmur of the wind outside. The room was eerily still, the silence broken only by the occasional flicker of streetlights across the glass. Hawke sat by the window, eyes fixed on the sprawling city below, but his mind was elsewhere, on the mission that had led him to this moment. His phone buzzed sharply, pulling him from his thoughts. The encrypted message was brief, but it carried the weight of his next move. The scientist has disappeared. Find him. Stop the deal. Hawke's jaw tightened as he read the message again, the gravity of the situation settling in. Dr. William Klein, a scientist with deep ties to a covert military research project, had gone off the grid. What should have been a simple extraction mission had turned into a race against time. The kind of mission where failure meant more than just a blown cover. It could mean the unraveling of entire nations. Hawke was well versed in these operations, but this was different. Klein wasn't just some defector or asset gone rogue. He was holding military secrets that, in the wrong hands, could tip the balance of global power. The scientist had vanished without a trace, and the only thing more unsettling than his disappearance was the knowledge that someone, somewhere, was likely orchestrating the very chaos Hawke was trying to prevent. The phone buzzed again, and Hawke's eyes flicked to the screen. It was another coded message from his handler. He took a breath, feeling the weight of his role settling on him. He couldn't afford to hesitate. This was the moment he was trained for, the thin line between order and catastrophe. Slipping the phone back into his pocket, he stood, adjusting the collar of his dark jacket and grabbing the small duffel bag by his side. Every move he made was deliberate, calm, even though beneath it all, his instincts were firing in all directions. This mission was unfolding in ways he hadn't anticipated. The stakes were rising, and if the scientist wasn't found soon, the consequences could be dire. Hawke knew the risks, but what unsettled him most was the gnawing feeling that this mission wasn't just about retrieving a lost asset. It was about something deeper, something darker. A conspiracy that had yet to reveal its full shape. The city outside was alive, its heartbeat a faint rhythm as he stepped into the corridor, moving with purpose. He was the hunter now, and the scientist was the prey. But Hawke also knew there were shadows lurking in the corners, unseen forces pulling strings, manipulating the game. It wouldn't be just Klein he had to worry about. It would be the invisible hands guiding him into a trap. The first lead would take him across the city, to a safe house rumored to be Klein's last known location. But as Hawke exited the hotel and slid into the back of a nondescript car, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning of something much larger. Something that would test not just his skills as an agent, but his loyalty to everything he believed in. As the car merged into the night traffic, Hawke settled back, his eyes scanning the darkened streets. A sharp flicker of neon light caught his attention in the reflection of the window. He glanced up, noticing the faint outline of a figure disappearing down an alley. Hawke's pulse quickened. It was a strange instinct he couldn't ignore. There was something more to this, something lurking behind the surface of the mission. The scientist was just the first piece. What followed could shatter everything. The game had begun. Chapter 2. The Shadow in the Alley. City, Vienna, Austria. Time, 3:30 a.m. Setting: narrow alley, dimly lit by a single flickering street lamp. The alley was silent, save for the occasional creak of the old street lamp hanging above. Hawke's car slowed as it neared the corner, the faint outline of a man barely visible in the darkness. It was the same figure he'd spotted moments earlier, slipping into the alley with an eerie fluidity that suggested a familiarity with the city's shadows. Instinct kicked in, sharp and urgent. Hawke's hand hovered over the door handle as the car came to a stop, the engine purring softly. He didn't need to know who the figure was. He just needed to know if they were connected to the missing scientist, Dr. Klein. But in his world, every figure in the shadows could be a threat, a potential key, or a false lead designed to throw him off course. Hawke waited for a beat, watching through the rearview mirror as the figure turned down the alley. Without a second thought, he opened the door and slipped into the night, his footsteps muffled by the wet pavement beneath him. The cold air cut through his jacket, sharp as the questions swirling in his mind. He approached the alley cautiously, his hand brushing the side of his jacket where his concealed pistol rested. It wasn't about intimidation, it was about being ready. Hawke had learned long ago that uncertainty could get you killed. As he reached the corner, the figure was gone, but the faint sound of hurried footsteps echoed in the distance. Hawke's pulse quickened as he turned the corner, his gaze darting to the shadows. There, the figure was moving swiftly, head low, trying to blend into the night. Hawke broke into a quiet sprint, keeping to the shadows as he closed the distance between them. The figure hadn't noticed him yet, but there was something about the way they moved, a deliberate evasion, a practiced escape. The chase felt familiar. He'd done this 1,000 times before, tracking, hunting, anticipating every step of his target. But this time, something gnawed at him. The figure wasn't just running. They were leading him somewhere. It was a calculated dance, and Hawke was just the pawn in their game. The alley opened up into a small courtyard, a forgotten corner of the city with graffiti-covered walls and abandoned crates. The figure stopped at the edge of the courtyard, standing still for a moment, as if they had planned the confrontation. Hawke froze, his senses on high alert. He was out in the open now, and the figure was watching him, waiting. There was no turning back. "I know you're following me," the figure said, their voice cold and steady, yet tinged with something else, something Hawke couldn't quite place. "I know why you're here." Hawke's hand instinctively moved to his sidearm, though he kept his finger off the trigger. "Then you know what happens next," he replied, his voice low, barely a whisper. The figure laughed, a bitter sound that echoed in the silence of the courtyard. "Do I?" They stepped forward into the dim light, their face finally coming into focus. It wasn't Klein.it, was a man Hawke hadn't seen in years, Elias Voss. The name hit Hawke like a punch to the gut. Voss had been one of the best agents in Hawke's agency, once a friend, once an ally. But that had been before the betrayal, before Voss had gone rogue, vanishing without a trace and leaving a trail of destruction behind him. Hawke had always suspected Voss's disappearance wasn't as simple as it seemed. Now, standing in front of him, Voss confirmed every lingering suspicion. "Elias," Hawke said, his voice steady despite the shock. "What the hell are you doing here?" Voss smirked, a cold, empty expression. "I'm doing what I always do, Hawke. I'm cleaning up your mess." Hawke narrowed his eyes, trying to read the man before him. "Cleaning up my mess?" he repeated. "You've been off the grid for years. You're still working for them?" Voss's smirk deepened. "The world's changed, Hawke. You still think you're the only one who sees the bigger picture. But you're wrong. You've always been wrong. Who are you working for?" Hawke pressed, every word sharp with suspicion. "This isn't just about Klein, is it? This is bigger than you're letting on." Voss took a step forward, his presence menacing. "You've got it all wrong, old friend. It's about survival. And for the first time, you're on the wrong side of the line." The air between them thickened, the tension palpable. Hawke's mind raced as he processed Voss's words. It wasn't just the scientist anymore. It wasn't just a rogue agent. This was a conspiracy, a dangerous game where the rules were designed to keep him off balance. "I'm not here for a fight," Hawke said, his tone measured. "I'm here to stop a war." Voss's eyes glinted with a knowing light. "You don't even know what you're up against. You're chasing ghosts, Hawke, and you're about to get burned." Before Hawke could respond, Voss turned and disappeared into the darkness, his silhouette fading into the night as quickly as it had appeared. Hawke stood in the courtyard, the sound of Voss's footsteps fading, leaving only silence in his wake. He was alone again, but the weight of the conversation hung heavy in the air. Voss had dropped a bombshell, and for the first time in a long time, Hawke wasn't sure who he could trust. The mission had just become a whole lot more complicated. Chapter 3. A Bitter Truth. City, Geneva, Switzerland. Time, 8:00 a.m. Setting, a high-rise office building overlooking Lake Geneva. The cold glass of the high-rise office was a stark contrast to the warmth of Hawke's thoughts. From this vantage point, the city looked peaceful, a sharp contrast to the storm that churned in his mind. Geneva was known for its neutral stance, its international treaties and diplomatic dialogues, but today it felt like a powder keg waiting to explode. Hawke had only one objective: find Dr. Klein and retrieve the critical military secrets before the world was thrown into chaos. The stakes couldn't have been higher, and yet, a gnawing feeling at the back of his mind told him there was more to the story than anyone had let on. Voss's words echoed in his mind. "You're on the wrong side of the line." He couldn't shake the feeling that he had stepped into a trap. Voss, the man who had once been his partner, was no longer just a rogue operative. He was a key piece in a much larger game. Hawke had worked with him long enough to know when something didn't add up, and nothing about this mission did. The elevator doors opened, and a tall, suited figure stepped out. Hawke didn't need to look twice to recognize the man. Victor Delgado, a senior analyst with the Swiss intelligence agency, had been an ally in the past, a useful resource when dealing with high-profile international matters. He was also one of the few people who could provide information without asking too many questions. "Morning, Hawke," Delgado said, his voice smooth but with a hint of unease. "I've got the latest intel on Dr. Klein. It's not good." "Tell me what you've got," Hawke replied, his eyes narrowing. He had already received a few reports about the scientist's disappearance, but they hadn't painted the full picture. Delgado had been the one to track down Klein's last known location, a small laboratory just outside the city, but it had been abandoned by the time Hawke had arrived. "We've traced Klein's movements back to the old university research facility near Lausanne. But here's the catch. He wasn't just working on military projects. He was also researching an experimental neural network, something far more advanced than what we've seen so far. Hawke absorbed the information. A neural network could be revolutionary, but in the wrong hands, it could be a weapon. The idea of using such a system to manipulate world events, control economies, nations, people was terrifying. Have you found the neural network? Where's Klein? Hawke asked, his voice laced with urgency. Delgado hesitated for a moment before continuing. That's the problem. We've had eyes on the university, but Klein's gone to ground. We lost contact with him 3 days ago. The last trace we found was a connection to an encrypted server, but the trail went cold after that. Hawke clenched his jaw. So he's vanished, just like that. Delgado nodded. Exactly. And there's more. The encrypted server. It's not linked to any government agency or university network. It's private. Private enough that we think someone else might be pulling the strings. Hawke's mind raced as he processed the information. A rogue scientist with access to cutting-edge technology, working with unknown entities. This wasn't just a missing scientist anymore. This was a global security threat. Do you have the coordinates for the last known location? Hawke asked, his voice flat. Yes, Delgado replied. He handed over a small data chip. It's all there, including the last few messages Klein sent. They'll lead you to the next step. Hawke took the chip and inserted it into his tablet. The screen flickered to life, displaying a series of coordinates, followed by a brief message from Klein himself. It read, "If you're reading this, then they've found me. Do not trust anyone. It's already too late." The words hit Hawke like a punch. There was no doubt now, Klein knew he was being hunted. But who had been after him and why? Hawke stood in front of the window, staring out at the tranquil view of Lake Geneva, trying to make sense of it all. There were too many unknowns, too many questions, and not nearly enough answers. The last thing Klein had written, "It's already too late," replayed in his mind like a warning bell. Delgado broke the silence, his voice tense. "Hawke, you have to be careful. If Klein was working on something this big, you're not the only one looking for him. The stakes have been raised." Hawke turned, meeting Delgado's gaze. "And that's exactly why I have to find him first." Without waiting for a reply, he turned and headed for the door. Delgado's voice followed him, but Hawke didn't stop. "You'll need backup," Delgado said, his tone serious. Hawke paused, his hand on the door. "I don't need backup," he replied. "I work alone." As he stepped out of the building into the brisk morning air, the weight of the mission pressed down on him. It was no longer just about finding Klein. It was about stopping a conspiracy that could plunge the world into chaos, that he had no choice but to follow the trail, even if it led him into the unknown. The red horizon was getting closer. Chapter 4. The Shadow in the Mist. City, Lausanne, Switzerland. Time, 4:30 p.m. Setting, a dimly lit cafe near the edge of Lake Geneva. Hawke sat alone in the back corner of the small cafe, his eyes scanning the room with practiced caution. The steam from his coffee drifted upward, mingling with the smell of baked pastries and the murmur of distant conversations. But Hawke wasn't focused on the ambience. He was focused on the entrance, on the shadows that could be hiding anyone, friend or foe. The coordinates Delgado had given him had led him to this quaint town, a short drive from Geneva. Klein's last known location had been here, near the university research facility, but Hawke's gut told him that finding Klein wasn't going to be as simple as tracking a few coordinates. He pulled out the encrypted chip from his jacket pocket and slid it into the small reader attached to his tablet. The information flashed across the screen, but it was fragmented. Pieces of messages, sporadic communication with what appeared to be an anonymous contact. The last message Klein had sent was cryptic at best, warning about a coming storm, but the details were too vague to decipher. Just as he was about to review the coordinates again, the door to the cafe opened with a soft chime. Hawke's eyes immediately flicked toward it, instinctively assessing the newcomer. A woman stepped in, her sharp, black trench coat and sleek, dark hair catching his attention. She scanned the room, her gaze lingering on Hawke for a moment too long before she made her way to the counter. Hawke didn't need to be told she was trouble. She moved with the practiced grace of someone accustomed to working in the shadows. Someone like him. He tapped the screen of his tablet, closing the encrypted file, then slid it back into his bag. He adjusted his seat slightly, leaning back in a way that allowed him to keep his eyes on the woman without being too obvious. The last thing he needed was to make his presence known to the wrong person. The woman ordered a coffee and sat down at a table near the far corner, her back to the wall. Hawke continued to watch her from his position. His gut told him that she wasn't just here for a casual drink. There was something off about the way she kept glancing around, always assessing, always aware. He couldn't shake the feeling that she was looking for someone. Perhaps him. It wasn't long before his instincts were proven right. As if sensing his scrutiny, she turned her head and their eyes locked for a brief, electric moment. Hawke's heart rate didn't change, but something inside him tightened. She was smart, and she had noticed him without a word. She stood and began walking toward his table. Hawke didn't move, didn't even flinch. The game was on, but this wasn't the first time he'd found himself in a similar position. "Mind if I join you?" she asked, her voice smooth, confident, a professional. Hawke nodded once, gesturing to the empty chair across from him. "You seem to be looking for someone." The woman's lips curled into a faint smile as she said, "I could say the same about you." She paused, studying him with a keen eye. "You're Hawke, aren't you?" Hawke's expression didn't change. "I don't know what you're talking about." "I think you do," she replied, leaning forward just slightly. "You've been poking around in things that don't concern you. The scientist Klein. You're tracking him, aren't you?" Hawke's pulse remained steady. If she knew about Klein, it meant she wasn't just a random observer. She was tied to the same operation, the same conspiracy. She wasn't here by chance. She had come for him. "You've been following me," Hawke said, "and now you're here to stop me." She gave a quiet, humorless laugh. "Not stop you, no, but I can't let you get too far ahead. You see, Klein's disappearance is part of a much larger plan. Something you might not be ready to understand." Hawke leaned back, his eyes narrowing. "And you think I'm not ready?" The woman's gaze hardened. "I'm not here to babysit you, Hawke, but you're not the only one interested in Klein. If you want to find him, you'll need more than just your usual tricks." She pushed a small envelope across the table toward him. Hawke stared at it for a moment before slowly picking it up. It was unmarked, but the weight of it told him that whatever was inside wasn't insignificant. "What's this?" he asked, not taking his eyes off her. "Information. A lead." "But I don't expect you to trust me," she said, standing to leave. "Just know that if you're going to get Klein, you'll have to step into the shadows where even the most skilled agents fear to tread." Hawke opened the envelope and pulled out a folded piece of paper. The message inside was brief but clear. "The red horizon is the key. Trust no one but yourself." It was all he needed to know. The red horizon. That was the phrase Klein had used in his last encrypted message. Was it a code? A location? He couldn't be sure, but it was clear that Klein was trying to tell him something before he vanished. The woman's figure faded into the evening mist as she walked out of the cafe, leaving Hawke to contemplate her cryptic warning. She had given him a lead, but whether it was genuine or part of a much larger game was yet to be seen. What Hawke knew now was that the game was escalating. The people behind Klein's disappearance weren't just pulling the strings. They were playing a dangerous game with the fate of the world in their hands. And Hawke was running out of time. As the mist from the lake crept in, Hawke made his decision. He would follow the lead, trust the words Klein had left behind. If there was one thing Hawke knew, it was that the deeper you went into the shadows, the harder it became to distinguish between friend and foe. But he wasn't about to let that stop him. The hunt for Klein had just become far more dangerous, and Hawke was ready. Chapter 5. Beneath the Surface. City, Zurich, Switzerland. Time, 11:30 a.m. Setting, a secluded warehouse by the docks. The air heavy with the scent of salt water and rust. Hawke's footsteps echoed in the narrow alley leading to the warehouse. The cold wind off Lake Zurich stung his face, but he paid it no mind. His focus was unwavering. The paper Klein had given him clenched tightly in his hand. The cryptic message about the red horizon had to mean something. He just had to figure out what. And the warehouse he was about to enter seemed as good a place as any to start. He had followed the woman's instructions, or rather, the fragmented clues she left behind. The more he learned, the less clear the situation became. There was something bigger at play here, and Hawke could feel it closing in on him. The conspiracy was deeper than just Klein's disappearance. Every step he took led him further into a web of deceit, manipulation, and power, one that might involve people he had once trusted. He reached the door of the warehouse, pausing to check for any signs of movement. The exterior was abandoned, worn down, with peeling paint and a rusted steel door that looked like it hadn't been opened in years. But Hawke knew better than to trust appearances. The place was a hub of activity for the right kind of people. People who operated in the shadows, people who had no interest in being found. His hand hovered near his gun, just in case, but he didn't draw it yet. The last thing he wanted was to give away his position before he knew what he was dealing with. He had been trained to read situations, to know when to act and when to wait. This was one of those times to wait. Hawke scanned the area again, noticing the faintest movement by the broken window on the upper floor. His instincts kicked in immediately, and he moved quickly, silently, toward the side entrance he had scoped out earlier. It was a low risk, no guards posted, but that didn't mean the area wasn't under surveillance. Whoever was behind this knew how to cover their tracks. Inside, the warehouse was eerily quiet. The space was vast, with only the occasional crate or box littering the floor. The distant hum of an old refrigeration unit echoed through the cavernous space. He moved further in, each step deliberate, each sense heightened. The location was too perfect, too quiet, and that made it more dangerous. There were no immediate threats, but the air felt thick with something unspoken. He had no idea who had been here before, but the signs of recent activity were clear. It wasn't the first time someone had entered this place. Hawke rounded a corner and froze. A figure stood at the far end of the warehouse, silhouetted against the light filtering through a grimy window. He was tall, wearing a long coat, his back turned to Hawke, but he didn't need to see the man's face to know who he was. The posture, the stance. This was no ordinary operative. Hawke approached cautiously, his gun ready now, but he kept it lowered, not wanting to make a sudden move. The figure didn't flinch, didn't turn. It was as if he was waiting for Hawke to make the first move. "I was wondering when you'd show up." The man's voice echoed through the silence, low and measured. Hawke's fingers twitched on the gun's grip. The voice was unmistakable. It was him, Lucas, an ex-operative from Hawke's agency, a man who had once been a close colleague. But Lucas was dead, or so everyone had thought. "Lucas," Hawke's voice was cold, controlled. "I thought you were gone, dead." The figure slowly turned to face him, revealing a scarred face that Hawke hadn't seen in years. Lucas's eyes, however, were unmistakable. They were the same, sharp, calculating, but colder now, as though the years had worn away whatever humanity Lucas had once possessed. "Dead," Lucas chuckled softly. "Not dead, Hawke. Just gone for a while. But I guess you could say I've been living on borrowed time ever since." Hawke's mind raced. Lucas had been the best, just as good as him, if not better. The two of them had been on countless missions together. They had trusted each other with their lives. But something had gone wrong, something that had broken their bond. Lucas had gone rogue, vanished from the agency, and had been presumed dead in a botched operation. But now, standing in front of Hawke, Lucas wasn't the man he remembered. There was no warmth in his eyes, no camaraderie, just a coldness that spoke of betrayal. "What are you doing here?" Hawke's voice was steady, though his mind was already calculating his next move. Lucas wasn't the only one capable of playing this game. "Same as you, I suppose," Lucas said, his voice laced with irony. "Looking for Klein. You're not the only one chasing ghosts, Hawke. You're just the one who hasn't figured out the truth yet." Hawke didn't respond immediately. His gaze never left Lucas, but the pieces were starting to come together. Lucas had known something vital about the disappearance of Klein, something he wasn't telling Hawke. "I don't have time for games, Lucas. Where is Klein?" Hawke demanded. Lucas's lips curled into a smile, but there was no humor in it. "It's not that simple, Hawke. Klein's not the one you need to be worried about." He stepped closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. "You're part of something bigger now, whether you like it or not. There's a game being played here, one that even your agency can't stop." Hawke's mind clicked into overdrive. Lucas had gone rogue for a reason. Something had happened. Something had turned him against everything they had once stood for. Hawke didn't know what it was yet, but he could feel the answer was close. "What are you talking about?" Hawke asked, his patience thinning. Lucas paused for a moment before speaking again. "The red horizon. It's not just a phrase, Hawke. It's a deadline. And when it arrives, everything changes." Hawke's heart skipped a beat. The words hung in the air between them, thick with meaning. But Lucas wasn't offering anything more. "What happens when the red horizon arrives?" Hawke pressed, his voice tense with anticipation. Lucas gave him a long, lingering look. You'll find out soon enough. But by then, it'll be too late for you to stop it. The words were a warning, but also a threat. Hawke knew he was no longer just chasing a missing scientist. The conspiracy had expanded, the stakes had risen, and the people behind it had the power to change the world in ways Hawke couldn't yet understand. But he was going to find out, and nothing was going to stop him. Chapter 6. The clock ticks. City, Belgrade, Serbia. Time, 4:00 a.m. Setting, a hidden safe house nestled in the labyrinthine backstreets of the city, a stark contrast to the chaos brewing in the shadows. The cold air outside cut through Hawke's jacket as he stepped out of the dimly lit safe house. His mind was a whirlwind of thoughts. The words Lucas had spoken still echoing in his ears like a haunting refrain. The red horizon. The warning was clear, but it was also cryptic, a threat that danced just beyond his grasp. The deeper he dug, the more elusive the answers became. And yet, the pull to uncover the truth was irresistible. The safe house was tucked away in a narrow alley, hidden behind the cluttered facades of derelict buildings. It was quiet, too quiet for comfort, as if the city itself held its breath, waiting for something monumental to occur. Hawke had always operated in the shadows, but this felt different. The air was thick with tension, as if the world was on the cusp of something irreversible. His first move had to be to find Klein, if the scientist was still alive, that is. But with Lucas's cryptic warning hanging in the air, Hawke couldn't shake the feeling that Klein's disappearance was only the tip of the iceberg. Someone or something was pulling the strings from behind the scenes, and it wasn't just about the scientist anymore. There was a larger game at play, one that threatened not just Hawke, but the very stability of the world itself. Hawke adjusted the collar of his jacket as he made his way through the streets, his steps silent on the cobblestones. His phone buzzed in his pocket, interrupting the quiet, and he pulled it out to see an encrypted message from Klein's last known contact, an underground informant named Victor. The scientist isn't the target, Hawke. You are. They've known about you from the start. Meet me at the abandoned cathedral. 10 a.m. Don't be late. Hawke's eyes narrowed. He had expected a message like this. Victor was a wild card, someone who played both sides and always operated under the radar. But if Victor was calling him out, it meant that the situation was even more complicated than he had anticipated. He had to be cautious. Nothing was as it seemed. The cathedral was an odd place for a meeting, especially given the city's history and the significance it held in the local underground scene. It was a place for those who operated in the dark corners of the world, a place where deals were made, lives were traded, and alliances were forged in secrecy. Hawke checked the time. He had 6 hours before the meeting, long enough to get some answers, but not enough time to waste. He needed information, and Victor was the key as he moved through the narrow streets of Belgrade. He kept his senses alert, his eyes scanning for any signs of movement, any hints of someone tailing him. His instincts had never failed him before, and now more than ever, he couldn't afford to let his guard down. The streets of Belgrade were quiet at this hour, the hum of the city's nightlife distant, replaced by the occasional sound of footsteps or a car passing in the distance. Hawke's mind was fixed on the meeting at the cathedral. He had been in enough of these situations to know that it wasn't going to be a straightforward exchange. The stakes had escalated far beyond Klein, far beyond even the red horizon. He was now in a race against time, and every step he took had to be calculated, deliberate. One wrong move and everything could unravel. He approached the cathedral's location by 9:45 a.m., keeping to the shadows as he circled the building. The massive structure loomed over the surrounding buildings, its once grand architecture now worn down by time and neglect. The doors were old and weathered, heavy with the weight of history. Hawke paused, analyzing the area. No signs of immediate threats, but that didn't mean the place was safe. With a deep breath, he pushed open the creaking door, his senses heightened, his hand resting on the handle of his concealed weapon. The interior of the cathedral was a striking contrast to the bustling streets outside. The air was heavy with the scent of dust and incense, and the high vaulted ceilings seemed to swallow any sound. The few rays of light that managed to pierce through the stained glass windows created an eerie glow that bathed the pews in shadows. Hawke moved cautiously through the aisles, scanning the space for Victor. There were no signs of life yet. He checked his watch, still 15 minutes to go. Every instinct told him that this place wasn't just a meeting point. It felt like a trap, a place where he could be cornered at any moment. A rustle of fabric broke the silence, and Hawke instinctively turned toward the sound. Out of the shadows stepped Victor, his face partially obscured by a hood. He was a man of few words, but Hawke had dealt with him enough to know that when Victor spoke, it was always with purpose. "You're early?" Victor's voice was low, almost mechanical, as if he were trying to control the situation. "Better early than never," Hawke replied, his gaze never leaving Victor's face. Victor nodded, stepping closer, his eyes scanning the space as though he expected someone else to show up at any moment. "I have information, but I need you to listen carefully, Hawke. Everything you think you know about Klein, about the Red Horizon, it's wrong." Hawke's heart rate quickened, but he remained calm. "What do you mean? Who's behind this?" Victor hesitated before speaking, as if weighing his words carefully. "The conspiracy goes deeper than just the scientist. It's global. Governments are involved. Powerful people pulling the strings from the shadows." Hawke's mind raced as he processed the information. If what Victor was saying was true, the stakes were much higher than he had imagined. And Klein? What happened to him? Victor's face grew grim. "Klein is alive, but not for much longer. He's being kept in a facility in the mountains, guarded by an organization you can't even begin to comprehend." The words hit Hawke like a punch to the gut. "And what about Lucas? What role does he play in all of this?" Victor's expression hardened. "Lucas is more than just a rogue agent, Hawke. He's been working for them, feeding you false information, trying to manipulate you into playing right into their hands." Hawke's grip tightened on his gun. The betrayal stung, sharper than he had anticipated. Lucas was not the man he had once known. "Then how do I stop it?" Hawke's voice was cold, edged with determination. Victor's eyes flickered to the shadows. "There's a plan in motion, but you have to act fast. The Red Horizon is not just a code. It's the final step in their mission. If you don't stop it now, it's over for all of us." As the weight of Victor's words settled in, Hawke knew that the world he knew had already begun to unravel. The clock was ticking, and he had no time to waste. He had to make a choice: stay loyal to his country or take a stand against a conspiracy that could change the world forever. Chapter 7. The Betrayal's Edge. City: Belgrade, Serbia. Time: 10:00 a.m. Setting. An abandoned safe house, hidden beneath the crumbling remnants of an old Soviet-era building. The cathedral's echoes still rang in Hawke's mind, the tension thick in the air as he left Victor behind in the shadows of their cryptic meeting. Everything he had believed, everything he had fought for, was starting to unravel. Lucas's betrayal cut deeper than a mere double-cross. It was a personal wound, one that could cost Hawke everything. He stepped into the dimly lit alley, his footsteps muted on the cracked concrete. The wind picked up, tugging at his jacket as he pulled out his phone, glancing at the encrypted message from Victor one more time. The scientist was in the mountains, but so was Lucas, and both of them were tied to a plot so far-reaching it threatened the entire geopolitical landscape. The Red Horizon was no longer just a mission, it was a countdown to a global catastrophe. The time for questions was over. Hawke had to act that he moved swiftly, dialing a number he hadn't used in years. The line rang once, twice. Then a voice, gravelly tired, answered. "This better be good, Hawke." It was Michael, an old ally from his earlier days in the agency. They had fought side by side, trusted each other with their lives. If anyone could help him now, it was Michael. "I need you to get me access to the satellite feeds in the Black Mountain region," Hawke said, his voice steady, but the urgency was unmistakable. "There's a facility up there, and I need to know what's happening inside." Michael's response was immediate, his voice shifting from annoyance to concern. "Black Mountain? You've got to be kidding me. That place is off limits. No one gets in there." "I'm not asking for permission," Hawke snapped. "I'm telling you to make it happen." There was a pause on the other end. Then Michael sighed. "All right, I'll get you the intel. But this is the last time I'm helping you out, Hawke. You're playing with fire, and this time, I don't think you'll get away unscathed." Hawke didn't respond. He didn't have time for a conversation about morality. He had a mission, and it was getting more dangerous with every passing hour. The stakes had shifted, and the enemy he faced was no longer a shadow. This was personal. The phone clicked off, and Hawke slid it back into his pocket. He was now headed to the outskirts of Belgrade, where he would rendezvous with a contact who would take him into the Black Mountain Range. Every part of his being was on edge, the weight of what was coming bearing down on him. That as he made his way through the city, past narrow streets and darkened alleyways, he kept his senses sharp. The city had a strange quiet to it this morning, as though it was waiting for something to happen. Maybe it was just his nerves playing tricks on him, but something felt off. It was as if everyone was watching him, waiting for him to slip up. The car he was meant to meet was parked in an alley a few blocks from the main road. A black SUV with tinted windows, unmistakable in its discreet design. Hawke approached cautiously, his hand resting on the concealed holster beneath his jacket. A man stepped out from behind the vehicle, his face obscured by the shadows of his hood. "You Hawke?" the man asked, his voice low and clipped. "I am," Hawke responded, his eyes scanning the surroundings. He wasn't taking any chances. The man nodded and handed him a small device. "This will get you in," he said, his voice betraying no emotion. "And it will give you access to the intel you need." Hawke took the device without hesitation. "How far is the mountain?" "About 2 hours out. We move now or we risk getting caught in the city's perimeter." Without another word, Hawke climbed into the vehicle and they drove off into the quiet morning. the tension in the air palpable as they left the city behind and headed toward the foothills of the Black Mountain Range. Hawke's mind returned to the message from Victor. The scientist, Lucas, the conspiracy. Every piece was falling into place, and yet the bigger picture remained elusive, that he couldn't shake the feeling that he was walking into a trap. The mountains were treacherous, both in their terrain and their secrecy. Whoever was guarding the facility had likely anticipated his movements. But Hawke wasn't about to let fear control his actions. His entire career had been built on outthinking the enemy, on staying one step ahead. If Lucas and the others thought they could outsmart him, they were gravely mistaken. The journey was long, the winding roads disappearing into the trees as the Black Mountain Range loomed ahead like an impenetrable fortress. The silence between the driver and Hawke was oppressive, broken only by the hum of the engine and the occasional crunch of gravel beneath the tires. As they approached the base of the mountains, the vehicle slowed, the trees growing denser, the air growing colder. It felt like they were entering another world, a place where secrets were kept and lives were lost in the shadows. The man driving the vehicle pulled over to the side of the road, his eyes scanning the surroundings before he spoke again. "This is as far as I go. There's a safe house up ahead, but it's a hike from here. You'll have to go on foot." Hawke didn't need any more information. He nodded and stepped out of the car, his hand instinctively going to the weapon at his side. The safe house was his next destination, and once inside, he would find the intel he needed to infiltrate the facility. The mountains stretched endlessly before him, the narrow trail ahead winding through dense woods and over jagged rocks. The cold air bit at his skin, but he pressed on, the faint glow of the safe house in the distance his only guide as he climbed higher into the mountains. The silence of the wilderness enveloped him. He was no longer in control of the situation. Every step he took, every decision he made, brought him closer to a confrontation that would change everything. A confrontation with Lucas.it wasn't just the mission that was at stake anymore. It was Hawke's very sense of who he was. Betrayal had a way of eroding trust, and as much as he wanted to believe that Lucas was still the man he once knew, the reality was that Lucas had already chosen his side. And Hawke would have to face the consequences of that decision. By the time Hawke reached the safe house, the sun was low in the sky, casting long shadows across the rocky landscape. He took a deep breath, steadying himself for what was to come. The clock was ticking, and soon he would have to make a choice, one that would define the future of not just his country, but the entire world. The red horizon was waiting. Chapter 8. The Brink of War. City, Black Mountain Range, Serbia. Time, 1:30 a.m. Setting, the hidden facility deep within the mountain, a labyrinth of steel, concrete, and shadows. The moon hung low over the jagged peaks, its pale light reflecting off the snow-covered terrain. As Hawke approached the facility, the safe house had given him only a moment's reprieve, a chance to regroup and plan. Now, standing at the edge of a steep cliff, the facility stretched before him, nestled deep into the heart of the mountain, camouflaged by the terrain and the secrecy that shrouded its existence. The Black Mountain had always been a place of myth, a place where few ventured and fewer still returned. Now it had become a prison of secrets, one that held not only the scientist but the key to the conspiracy that threatened to ignite the flames of war. His thoughts drifted briefly to Victor's warning. The scientist had to be alive. He was the only one who could stop the impending disaster. But the closer Hawke came to the facility, the more he sensed a growing unease. He wasn't just up against an adversary. He was battling against time itself. If he failed, the world would fall into chaos. He made his way through the forest, staying low, moving with the precision of someone who had spent years hunting in the shadows. The trees around him whispered with the cold wind, and every crack of a branch underfoot felt like an alarm. But his instincts were honed, and his focus was absolute. The mountain's silence was unnerving, the weight of the mission pressing against him. This wasn't just another job. This was personal. Lucas had betrayed him. Lucas was here, somewhere in the shadows, waiting for him, and Hawke could feel the tension simmering, like an invisible string being pulled tighter and tighter as he approached the perimeter of the facility. He checked the small device Michael had given him. It flickered once, then green lights flashed, signaling that he had the access he needed. Hawke smiled to himself, a cold, calculated expression. Nothing was going to stop him now. Slipping through the perimeter, he moved silently, using the darkness as his ally. His breath came out in controlled puffs, the cold biting at his skin, but his mind was razor-sharp, tuning out everything except his goal. He had to get in, get the scientist, and get out. Simple. Except nothing about this was ever simple. That he approached the main building, an imposing structure, fortified with concrete and steel. Guards were stationed at regular intervals, their eyes scanning the perimeter, but they were predictable, routine, and that was Hawke's advantage. The facility was a fortress, but not an impenetrable one. Every inch of it had been designed with security in mind, but Hawke's mind was a maze of strategies, each one more calculated than the last. He observed the guards, their patterns, their weaknesses, and within minutes, he was inside. The facility's halls were eerily quiet, the sound of his boots on the cold floor the only noise that accompanied him. He moved swiftly, avoiding cameras and motion sensors with expert precision. The deeper he went, the more he could feel the weight of the conspiracy pressing down on him. The secrets hidden here weren't just about weapons or intelligence. They were about control, power, the kind of power that could alter the course of history. His path led him to a long corridor, one that seemed to stretch endlessly before him. At the far end, a door stood, unmarked, its surface cold and sterile. It was the kind of door that concealed the unknown. Behind it, he knew, was the scientist, and Lucas. His heart raced as he approached the door. There would be no turning back after this. Once inside, there would be no more shadows to hide in. The confrontation would be inevitable, and it would be brutal. That he reached for the door's handle, and just as his fingers brushed it, he heard a voice. "I knew you'd come." The words were soft, calm, yet they struck Hawke like a thunderclap in the stillness. He froze, his instincts screaming at him to act, but the voice stopped him. The voice that he had once trusted. The voice that now belonged to Lucas. "I'm not here for a reunion, Lucas," Hawke said, his voice cold, his hand tightening around the grip of his weapon. "I'm here to stop you." Lucas stepped into view, emerging from the shadows at the end of the corridor. He was still the same, yet different. The years had carved lines of hardness into his face, but his eyes, those eyes, still held the same coldness that had once made him the perfect operative. "You always did think you were better than me," Lucas said, his voice tinged with bitterness. "You always thought you had the moral high ground. But you've missed the bigger picture, Hawke. What bigger picture? Hawke demanded, his voice growing sharper. The one where you betray your country for some personal vendetta? Is that it? Lucas smiled, but it wasn't a smile of triumph. It was a smile of defeat, the kind of smile someone gives when they know the end is near, but they've accepted it. No, Hawke, the bigger picture is about survival. It's about the world we're leaving behind and the one that's coming. This facility, the secrets it holds, they're just the beginning. We're on the brink of something far more dangerous than you could ever imagine. Hawke took a step forward, his gun still drawn. I'm not interested in your cryptic speeches. I'm here to stop you. You've crossed a line. Lucas's smile faded, and for a brief moment, there was a flicker of the man Hawke had once called a friend. But it was gone in an instant, replaced by the steely resolve of someone who had made their choice. You've always been so quick to play the hero, Hawke, but sometimes there is no right choice. There is only the one you make. Hawke didn't hesitate. With a swift motion, he aimed his weapon and fired, the sound of the shot ringing through the corridor. But Lucas wasn't there. The shadows swallowed him up, and the hallway was empty once more. For a moment, Hawke stood frozen, the adrenaline coursing through him, his mind racing to process what had just happened. But as the silence stretched on, he knew one thing with certainty. Lucas had set the stage for the final act, and the real battle was only just beginning. The red horizon had arrived, and it was more dangerous than Hawke could ever have prepared for. Chapter 9. The Edge of Betrayal. City, Black Mountain Facility, Serbia. Time, 3:30 a.m. Setting, the deepest level of the facility, where secrets and lies have built walls stronger than steel. The silence that followed Lucas's disappearance hung heavily over the hallway. Hawke stood motionless, the weight of his own breath the only sound that accompanied the erratic beat of his heart. The walls around him seemed to close in, the quiet oppressive, as though even the building itself was holding its breath. He didn't believe for a second that Lucas had just vanished into thin air. This was no ordinary agent. Lucas had always been the one with the upper hand, the one who manipulated the shadows to his advantage. Hawke had spent years trying to figure him out, but now he was facing something much more insidious than a simple rogue operative. Lucas wasn't just betraying his country. He was on the verge of reshaping the world. Hawke pushed forward, aware that every step he took in this labyrinth of steel could be his last. The door he had been heading toward was now only a few feet away, but the encounter with Lucas had altered the urgency of his mission. He wasn't just fighting for the scientist anymore, he was fighting for the future. If Lucas's plans came to fruition, it wouldn't just be the collapse of a few governments. It would be the dawn of a new world order, one built on chaos, violence, and bloodshed. He reached the door, his gloved hand resting on the cool metal as he gathered his thoughts. Inside that room was the key to stopping it all, the scientist. But there was also another key, Lucas, the same man who had once been Hawke's closest ally, the same man who had chosen betrayal over loyalty, power over principle. He pushed the door open slowly, the hinges creaking in protest, and entered the darkened room. The facility's power was erratic, the hum of electricity barely audible in the stillness. Hawke's eyes quickly adjusted to the dim light, scanning the room for any sign of movement. The scientist's face flashed through his mind, the last memory of him being the frantic call for help. Now that plea had become an urgent mission, one that couldn't fail, and yet, in this room, it was not the scientist's face that haunted him, but Lucas's. The cold, calculating eyes. The promise of a battle that could unravel everything Hawke had worked for. There was no way to deny it. The situation had escalated far beyond what Hawke had imagined. He was no longer just hunting a missing person. He was on the brink of a global conspiracy, and Lucas was the one pulling the strings. The room was eerily quiet, with only the faint beeping of machines and the soft sound of ventilation filtering through the air. As he stepped further into the room, he caught sight of a figure seated in the far corner, partially obscured by a shadow. Dr. Petra Stravinsky. Hawke's voice broke the silence. The woman looked up, her face gaunt, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and confusion. She hadn't expected him. You're Hawke." "I am," he said, keeping his voice steady. "Are you all right?" She nodded, her hands trembling as she slowly stood up from her seat. "I've been trapped here. They won't let me go." Hawke stepped closer, his gaze never leaving her. The scientist was a vital piece to this puzzle. If she had the answers, he needed to extract them fast. The mission had changed again. What had been a search for a missing person had now turned into something much darker. "You have to trust me. Lucas isn't what he seems," Hawke said, his voice low. "He's planning something catastrophic." Her eyes widened in recognition, and a look of dread crossed her face. "I know. He's been manipulating things for months now. The project, it was never meant to stay secret. It was never meant to be contained. But they're going to use it. Use me." Hawke's mind raced. What exactly are they planning to do? She took a shaky breath, her eyes flickering to the corner of the room. The technology one developed, it's capable of launching a global communications blackout. But it's not just for espionage. Lucas has connections. He's working with factions from across the globe. They're going to use it to destabilize entire governments, initiate global chaos. Hawke felt the floor beneath him shift. This was worse than he had imagined. The blackout was only the beginning. The technology in this facility was the spark that would set off an international powder keg. "But why you? Why do they need you?" Hawke pressed, his tone demanding an answer. "They need me to activate the system. Without me, the technology is useless. I'm the key," she explained, her voice trembling now. "But if they can control the signal, they'll have the ability to destabilize the economy, control national security systems. They'll hold the world hostage." Hawke's pulse quickened. Lucas wasn't just a traitor. He was orchestrating the collapse of civilization. If he could get his hands on the technology and harness it, no country would be safe. "Where is it? Where's the system?" Hawke demanded. Petra looked towards a terminal against the far wall, its screen flickering in the dim light. "It's all there. You have to stop Lucas. He's already activated the first phase of the plan. You can't let him finish." A rush of adrenaline coursed through Hawke's veins. Every moment counted. The clock was ticking, and he was running out of time. Suddenly, the distant sound of footsteps echoed down the hallway. Someone was coming. Hawke's instincts kicked in. He had to move fast. "Stay close and don't make a sound," he whispered as Petra nodded. Hawke made his way to the terminal, his eyes scanning the code that appeared on the screen. His fingers flew over the keys as he input commands, blocking the first stage of the launch sequence. But he knew that was only a temporary fix. The real battle was about to begin. Lucas was coming, and Hawke would need every ounce of his cunning to stop him. There was no room for error now. The fate of the world hung in the balance. The stage was set for the final confrontation, the one that would decide the course of history. Hawke couldn't let Lucas win. Not this time. Chapter 10. The Final Reckoning. City, Black Mountain Facility, Serbia. Time, 5:00 a.m. Setting, the heart of the facility, where secrets bleed into the atmosphere and the line between loyalty and betrayal is blurred beyond recognition. The air in the Black Mountain facility grew thicker with every passing second, as if the walls themselves had absorbed the weight of the decisions that had led to this moment. Lucas's shadow loomed large over the corridor ahead, and Hawke could feel the tension radiating through the steel and concrete, pressing against his chest with a force that made each breath harder to take. That he had come this far, too far to back down now. The technology was within reach. Petra was by his side, silent and still, but he knew the storm of thoughts swirling inside her. She had once been on the same side, trusted Lucas, and now she faced the gravity of everything that had gone wrong. She was just as much a prisoner in this game as he was. "Stay close," Hawke whispered, his voice barely audible in the silence of the facility. "We're almost there." Petra nodded, her eyes dark with the weight of her own knowledge. There was no turning back. The system was ready to launch, and Lucas, who had once been the closest thing Hawke had to a brother, was now the one responsible for the collapse of everything they had fought for. They reached the final hallway. The door to the control room was ahead, guarded by armed personnel. Lucas's voice, calm, calculated, and disturbingly cold, floated from the other side of the door. "I knew you'd come for her," Lucas said, his words carried through the thick steel. "But you're too late, Hawke. The world is already on the brink." Hawke's heart skipped a beat. He had to get in now. He couldn't let Lucas finish the operation. If Lucas was right, there was no telling how much damage had already been done. The blackout was just the first wave. The world's fragile stability was teetering on the edge of a knife, and if the launch sequence continued, no one would be able to stop it. "Stand by," Hawke muttered under his breath, his hand hovering over the edge of his firearm, ready for whatever came next. Petra looked at him, the gravity of the situation finally setting in. "You'll have to kill him, won't you?" Hawke didn't answer. The reality was clear. Lucas had crossed a line that could not be uncrossed. The betrayal wasn't just personal. It was global, a threat that could reshape the world in an instant. If Hawke was going to stop him, he would have to be prepared to face the man who had once been his closest ally. As the door slid open with a heavy groan, the sight of Lucas standing behind a row of monitors hit Hawke like a punch to the gut. The control room was a sea of flashing lights and rapidly changing data, the kind of place where decisions weren't just made. They were enacted in real time with devastating consequences. Lucas turned slowly, his smile a thin, sinister line across his face. "You really think you can stop this?" he asked, his voice as cold as ever. "The game has already been played, Hawke. You're too late." Hawke stepped inside, keeping his gun trained on Lucas as he scanned the room. The monitors flashed with data, much of it too fast for him to process, but he could tell it was bad. The countdown had begun. You never understood, did you? Lucas continued, as if the chaos unfolding around them was simply a mild inconvenience. The world can't stay the way it is. People are weak. Corruption runs deep. The only way to create a new order is to break the old one, to destroy it, to tear everything down and rebuild from the ashes. Hawke's grip tightened on his weapon. His mind flashed to all the years spent working with Lucas, the shared missions, the silent understanding between them. All of it had been a lie. This wasn't about saving the world, it was about taking control of it. "Stop the launch, Lucas," Hawke said, his voice low but firm. "It's over." But Lucas merely laughed, a hollow sound that echoed through the sterile room. "You think you're the hero here? That somehow you've been on the right side of history? Let me tell you something, Hawke. This world is broken, and you can't fix it by playing by the old rules. The only way forward is through destruction. The only way forward is through me." With a sudden movement, Lucas hit a button on his console, and the countdown accelerated, the numbers ticking away faster than Hawke could process. "Let her go, Lucas." Petra spoke up, her voice shaking, but strong. "You don't have to do this. You can still stop." Lucas's eyes flickered toward her, and for a split second, there was a flicker of something, regret, or perhaps just a cold recognition of what was about to happen. But it was gone in an instant, replaced by the ruthless glint of determination. "You still don't understand, do you?" Lucas sneered. "There is no stopping it now. This is beyond you." Hawke didn't hesitate. He lunged forward, aiming directly at Lucas, but the man was faster. A sharp crack of gunfire split the air, and Hawke's world exploded into chaos. He felt the sharp sting of a bullet grazing his shoulder, but the pain was secondary. Adrenaline surged through him as he fired back, the bullet hitting Lucas square in the chest. Lucas staggered back, his face contorting in shock and disbelief. The man who had been his closest ally, the man who had once shared everything with him, was falling. "No!" Lucas gasped, his breath ragged. As the monitors around him began to flicker and die, the countdown halting in its tracks, with his last breath, Lucas managed a smile, a bitter, resigned expression. "You'll never understand, Hawke," he whispered, before collapsing to the ground, lifeless. The room fell into silence, save for the soft hum of the remaining machines. Hawke stood there for a moment, the weight of the action settling into his bones. He had stopped the launch, but at what cost? Lucas was gone, his plans shattered, but the devastation left in the wake of his betrayal would linger. Hawke turned to Petra, his face hardening. "The mission isn't over. We need to get out of here before this place comes down on us." As they made their way out of the control room, Petra glanced back, her eyes filled with a mix of relief and sorrow. "Is it really over?" Hawke paused for a moment, looking at her. "No," he said softly. "It never is." Together, they made their way to the extraction point, the dawn breaking over the mountains outside. The world would never be the same. But for the first time in a long time, Hawke felt the burden of his choices lift, knowing that he had stopped the storm before it could engulf them all. And as the helicopter lifted off into the sky, the horizon ahead still seemed red, but this time it was a horizon of hope. The battle was over, but the war, like the secrets of the fallen, would continue to haunt them all.